So tell us, there is one stock that I think really exemplifies just the level of market speculation out there. It is the company formerly known as MicroStrategy, kind of a cult stock. It is up around 600% over the past year alone.
I mean, yeah, its performance stands out even among other huge gaining stocks like your Nvidias and your Palantirs. And it's sort of a microcosm of all the ways that markets have changed over the past few years. The rise of individual investors, the big rallies in crypto, and just the boom in risk taking generally.
It's fascinating. And to understand its rise, we sat down with one of our favorite colleagues, Jon Weil, to dive into what's going on with the stock and its wild ride.
Hey everyone, I'm Telis Demos. I write for the Wall Street Journal's Heard on the Street.
And I'm Gunjan Banerji, lead writer for markets here at the Wall Street Journal. And this is WSJ's Take on the Week, where we are giving you a leg up on the world of money and investing.
Each week, we bring you conversations with insiders from inside the Wall Street Journal's newsroom about business, finance, economics, and a few more things too.
Tell us, it has been a crazy few weeks, few sessions for the markets. There's just been so much whiplash out there, particularly around tariffs.
Yeah.
What do you think are the chances we are out of the woods here?
We are not. So just to catch up, President Trump, of course, instigated a trade war, albeit a brief one, by proposing a 25% tariff on imports from Canada and Mexico. That sent the market reeling and then unreeling, I guess you'd say, charging back when he said the tariffs would be delayed for a month. But the issue is far from settled because it is still ongoing with China, a very significant trade partner, obviously. A 10% tariff went into effect against on Chinese imports, and China reacted. And now President Trump and President Xi Jinping of China have to talk. So I think we're far from out of the volatility woods on that one.
So this really has the potential to roil markets. I was getting deja vu of Trump's last administration, where it seemed like every tweet, every salvo just drove these crazy swings in stocks, currencies, commodities around the world. However, when I was chatting with investors over the past few days, I feel like they were taking a more sanguine position on everything going on and saying, look, we think the tariffs are a negotiating tactic. This is the starting point, not, the end all be all of this economic policy that could affect markets.
Well, I humbly disagree with some of your
All right.
esteemed sort of investor sources, just because I think that China really, I think, is the litmus test. Because I think there are, what I've read in the journal's reporting is that there are people within the administration who really think that we need a major reset with China to avoid what some people call like a China shock 2.0, where we are outcompeted by China in electric vehicles, renewables, things like that. And also, I also think that there are going to be specific companies that get caught up in the crossfire here.
This could be a specific company situation rather than a broad market fiasco,
Absolutely.
right?
So even if you're sanguine about those things, and don't forget, tariffs aren't just about countries either. We have to be on the lookout for things about specific products. Trump has said that product tariffs on things like semiconductors, oil and gas, steel. I mean, he said that those could start about the 18th of February. So I think next week there could definitely still be tariff headline news that moves the markets significantly.
One thing to keep in mind, an investor said this to me over the past week, was like, no matter what happens, maybe this is really bad for markets. It's really tough to time when. And he was saying, I would not want to trade that news. Like, don't try to trade these headlines.
Well, I don't trade anything, so I don't have to worry about that.
I do want to pivot to crypto, though, because there's been so much going on there ever since Trump's inauguration. And I think the past week really made it clear that this is kind of a sentiment indicator, right? Like a pulse check on how excited or pessimistic people are feeling about risky assets, about the markets, broadly speaking.
Okay, but wait a second. But I've read that Bitcoin is digital gold. It's like
it was not
something
acting like
apart
gold.
from the markets.
It has not been acting like gold.
Interesting. Okay.
It's been acting like tech stocks, right? It's been acting like the S&P 500. Last week when traders first heard about this tariff news and the prospect of tariffs on Mexico, China, Canada, crypto prices started tumbling. When things started to calm down, the next trading session, Bitcoin started rallying again.
So they're not like gold or treasuries, at least lately, the way they're trading. I do think it's going to continue to be a very interesting week for crypto. I know I will be certainly looking out for Coinbase's earnings.
Ooh, yeah.
Coinbase Global, one of the major sort of crypto companies. And I would actually expect some positive things coming out of their business outlook. I mean, the things in Washington are really moving in the direction that I think a lot of people were hoping for coming into the Trump administration. He signed an executive order recently saying that they were not going to pursue a government form of crypto, a central bank digital currency. I mean, that means that the government won't be competing with crypto in crypto. And the SEC has started to change direction. And I would also expect that at some point, I don't know if it's next week, but like some point in the near future, we are going to get the Senate looking at President Trump's nominee for the SEC, Paul Atkins. I don't know if that's going to start next week necessarily, but I would expect to start hearing about that and the committees forming to sort of look at his nomination. And I think there could be some fireworks there.
One thing I'm watching really closely, Robinhood earnings. Not really for the earnings so much, but I'm really curious what Vlad Tenev, their CEO, has to say. They listed these event contracts tied to sports. So basically allowing their customers to bet on the Super Bowl.
Like they did for the presidential election. And that was a big
Exactly.
success
Yeah,
for them, right?
think the election bets,
Okay,
which
yeah.
really seemed to take off. And the CFTC said, wait a minute, not yet. You can't list these quite yet. But I think this is just a really big theme to follow, the intersection of gambling, investing, and trading, and just the idea of being able to
Yeah.
bet on sports on the very same app. You can bet on stocks, you can trade
Yeah.
options, and crypto is really interesting. There's been so much going on, even as a journalist. I don't know if you feel this way, but it's been hard to stay on top of everything, right? But
Yeah,
one
remember
thing,
my getting to bed and sleeping well?
not going well.
Not going well at all. Not going well at all.
But one thing I cannot stop watching is MicroStrategy. Oh, they now called Strategy. They changed their name to Strategy.
There you go.
Their stock price, it has been on an insane run, up around 15% just this year and, around 600% over the last 12 months. And to indulge my obsession, I said we have to have Jon Weil on the podcast to talk about this stock.
Well, those are two of my obsessions: Strategy, formerly MicroStrategy, and Jon Weil. So this is perfect for me. This is a stock
Win-win.
that, like you mentioned, it's up over 2,000% since the start of 2020. That's you heard that right, 2,000. That is because that year is the year it started doing something that maybe seemed odd at the time for what is otherwise like a kind of a business software company to do, which was to buy Bitcoin. Not because it's in the Bitcoin business, but because it just saw value in Bitcoin and owning it in its treasury for its corporate cash.
And of course, the market seemed to love the idea, right? Its stock price soared. It kept rising and rising and rising. And MicroStrategy was kind of quick to tap that, right? They started issuing more shares, they started issuing bonds, all to buy more Bitcoin. Investors loved it, and they rewarded it with this kind of mammoth valuation.
Well, but some folks have also now been skeptical of what arguably boils down to a sort of disconnect between the Bitcoin they own, which is in the neighborhood of 45 billion, and the market value of the company, which is in the neighborhood of, 80, 90 billion right now. And they wonder why you would pay essentially more for Bitcoin to own a share in this company than you would to just buy Bitcoin outright in the market. And Jon Weil, our colleague, is one of the people that isn't so sure that investors bet on this company, at least at this price, will ultimately pay off. He's a columnist for Heard on the Street, so he sits pretty close to me. And
us.
our job is to analyze companies, look at their market value, and ask questions, and kind of say that we think there are things that investors should be looking at or should consider. And so, he's been following MicroStrategy's wild ride quite closely lately. And before we get to it, I just want to say two things. One is we spoke to Jon before MicroStrategy announced its name change to Strategy. So when you hear us talking about MicroStrategy, that's the context. The other thing I want to say is that we reached out to Strategy for comment, and they did not respond to our request for comment by our deadline. So let's get to that conversation with Jon after the break. So we are excited to have our Wall Street Journal colleague, Jon Weil. He writes for Heard on the Street, like I do. He's with us today to talk about his reporting and analysis of, Gunjan, all respect to you, cult stock, maybe, MicroStrategy. Jon, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
So Jon, let's just set the stage here a little bit. So up until a few years ago, MicroStrategy was known, if it was known at all by most people, as a software company. It was in the business of business intelligence software, which sounds important but boring. Great. In the decade prior to 2020, its market cap was like typically 2 billion or below, somewhere in that neighborhood. But then everything changed when its now executive chairman, Michael Saylor, started buying Bitcoin in 2020 and buying and buying and buying. As of early February, the company had over 470,000 Bitcoins, which at today's price of Bitcoin in the neighborhood of 97,000, call it, as of this recording, that's about $45 billion worth of Bitcoin as we're talking about it now. And its stock has skyrocketed along with that because it seems simple. They bought a lot of Bitcoin. The price of Bitcoin went up. Step one, buy Bitcoin. Step two, profit.
Genius.
But of course, nothing is ever really that simple. You've described some what you call wacky math around the company. The headline to one of your columns about it was Magical Bitcoin Buying Machine. So tell us what is not straightforward about MicroStrategy as just a company that owns Bitcoin.
It actually is pretty straightforward when you're. It's when you look at it from a straightforward angle that you realize that the math doesn't make sense. And
Tell us why. Break
So-
that down for us. Why doesn't the math make sense to you?
if I could buy a Bitcoin from you for the price is $95,000, or I could buy it from you for $170,000. Now, if I had that choice, all other things being equal, I'd rather pay the
Sure.
lower price. If you are buying Bitcoin, again, you control it. It's not taxed if you make a profit until you sell it. If you buy another shares of a company that owns Bitcoin, and that company's stock is overvalued, you're effectively paying a multiple of what you could just pay yourself if you went to Coinbase or some other brokerage, or just even back alley on the street and you trade your keys and
So you're saying people are paying a premium
yes,
for Bitcoin
if-
when they're buying MicroStrategy
I guess if you break it
stock?
down, right, it's an $80 billion company that owns $45 billion
Well,
worth
and they have-
of Bitcoin. And the other part of its business, I think most would agree, is not worth the difference.
And it's not just comparing the market cap with the value of the Bitcoin. They've also taken on at least $7 billion of debt. And so what you have here is an incredible anomaly that is happening during what appears to be a very euphoric point in the markets. And common sense, the very popular phrase to be using nowadays, common sense would suggest that at some point you will get parity again. And at some point the value of the Bitcoin the MicroStrategy owns will, converge with the value of MicroStrategy itself.
And is that painful when that happens?
Oh,
necessarily?
if you paid $500 a share for it, and now as of when I looked up before coming in here, it's down to about $310 a share. If you bought at $500, that's pretty painful. And my read, especially if you look at all of the social media fans of this stock, my read on this is that you have retail buyers who just think Bitcoin's going to go up. They believe in Bitcoin. They believe in this very charismatic executive chairman is his title now that they have Michael Saylor.
You're talking about, okay.
And they believe him. It's not about the numbers. It's just about the FOMO and getting in now before it goes up more and not missing out. And people who were buying this are either buying it because they just think it's going to go up because other people haven't figured it out, or they themselves haven't figured it out.
Okay, so we're talking about why would people be willing to pay more for MicroStrategy to own a Bitcoin than to just own it themselves. And you've written a lot about companies that just have a, for lack of a better term, cult following. There's a personality like a charismatic leader at the company. Do you think this is an example of that as well?
Yeah, I was talking to someone who put it really well, and they said that this has been a moment for kind of the cult leader among investors. I mean, think about what Elon Musk is to Tesla investors or what Alex Karp is to Palantir investors. That's a key part of the reason people keep investing in those stocks. And it's actually having impacts on the market. Cliff Asness, a really famous quantitative investor, recently said that markets these days stay inefficient for longer than they ever have before, in part because some of these forces that have fueled MicroStrategy. Think the rise of individual investors, riskier and riskier ways to play the market. Jon, I know you've written about like leveraged exchange-traded products, what's going on in the options market, and then social media. So that leads people to kind of herd around stocks like Tesla, MicroStrategy, Palantir a lot more than they would have in the past.
I concur. Market inefficiencies do seem to be lasting much longer than they used to be. The notion of meme stocks or
Yes.
meme anything,
Everything is a
taking
meme.
on lives of their own, and we don't know when that will end. Maybe not in our lifetimes, if the whole, if the axis of the Earth is really tilted. But the flip side of that, to the old guys, people who remember things like March 2000 and 2008, and you can go back and read about the go-go years of the 1960s, or any number of other different. These things tend to correct themselves eventually. Markets are not necessarily efficient in the short term, but over the long term, they tend to be. And when they do correct, it can get really vicious. And the more cultish the following, the more vicious the whiplash can be when it goes in the other direction.
I mean, one reason, Jon, that I think it's really interesting to talk to you about this is because you've made a career out of like taking a company that seems to be doing something new that people are excited about, and you do this crazy thing where you just actually read all of the documents. Like you go into the disclosures.
Heaven forbid.
You go into the
All
and
of
these
them.
we're not talking like dumpster diving. We're talking like clicking on the sec.gov, sorry.
Professional
SEC.gov.
investigative reporting technique. Yes, you open
Um,
the 10K.
And so what are some of the things that you see in MicroStrategy's like disclosures and financial statements that caught your attention?
Well, every new mania needs new metrics in order to explain itself and help justify new investment by new investors. And so sometime this summer, MicroStrategy came up with this term they called BTC Yield, and it was amazing looking. It would be up one period, BTC Yield, the headline of a press release. It's up 24%. Oh, it's up 50%. It's up in the 60% somewhere, even higher.
Those are not like a typical yield, right? The
This
the
is not-
dividend
yeah,
yield of a company is somewhere in the 5% range, right? Maybe 10%.
Yield-
But you're talking about yields that are,
Yield. The term yield has a very common understanding. When you're talking about a dividend yield, it's the dividend divided by the stock price. Just as an example, if you're talking about the yield on a bond, it's the interest rate divided by whatever you paid for the bond, or whatever the bond's trading at right now. This term BTC yield doesn't have anything to do with any of that. If BTC yield is neither BTC nor yield, if this were a Linda Richmond episode of Mike Myers
bringing back some
SNL
SNL favorites.
all he
there.
did was he changed. It's a percentage figure showing the percentage change from one period in time to that other period of time in the Bitcoin per share owned by the company.
But why should
That's it.
investors care about this?
They really shouldn't. They should care about the value of the Bitcoin per share, not the number of Bitcoins per share, if they even care about that. It's just and then the math in there was explained poorly enough so that people would not necessarily understand what the company was using for its definition of this invented metric. But it was at the same time they gave enough of a descriptive explanation that you could actually pull the numbers and figure out, oh, this is just period over period change in Bitcoin per share, which is not really a meaningful metric in any traditional sense, for sure.
So if you're a regular investor and you're trying to think, you're attracted to stocks that are new, companies
going
doing
up.
things new and going up. What would you advise someone to look at?
My view is that if you're going to be buying individual stocks, you really should be financially literate. You
Yeah.
should understand how to read. You should be able to pick up a 10K and read an income statement,
Yeah.
balance sheet, cash flow statement, and read through the footnotes and
Yeah.
be able to
Yeah.
get from that a pretty good understanding of what the company does, compare that with the valuation, and be able to make an informed case. Otherwise, you should just be index investing if you're going to be buying in the stock market.
Well, lesson one for those who are not already doing that, a 10K is a company's annual report.
So, Jon, you've written a little bit about taxes and MicroStrategy. What's going on there?
Very strange reality is swirling around them. There was this thing that happened during the Biden administration called the Inflation Reduction Act. It had a bunch of different provisions in it, including tax provisions. And one of those was designed to get at the phenomenon of companies that look immensely profitable in the numbers they tell their investors under generally accepted accounting principles, while telling the IRS, we make no money and we owe no taxes. Okay, so with the Inflation Reduction Act, one of the things it did was it said to companies, okay, if you were showing the IRS you're not making any taxable income, we're going to look at your GAAP financial statements, your GAAP income statement, and if you're making, we're going to make sure you pay at least 15% of the number that's on there, what they call the corporate alternative minimum tax. It's very unusual in U.S. history to be taxing people based upon their GAAP earnings because those include unrealized gains. Unrealized gains means you bought something that went up in value, you haven't sold it. Now, the IRS has already come out with exemptions for certain types of investments. MicroStrategy has not gotten exemption. So they are uniquely impacted by this because they have a software business that is not profitable, that generates no taxable income. So the default would be, okay, the government would be applying the alternative minimum tax on their GAAP earnings, which starting this year are going to be tremendous. And so there's a prospect that MicroStrategy would have to sell Bitcoin just to pay the tax bill, and that can create all sorts of snowball problems.
So it sounds like the bottom line here is that unless this issue is resolved, and it might be,
it's going to be an overhang on the stock.
Just a great reminder that again, buying individual stocks is a tough business, and you need to be prepared for all these things.
We are going to take one final break, and when we come back, we have one final question with Jon Weil.
So, Jon, to the best of your ability, if you had to look into the crystal ball and think about how you talked about this kind of disconnect in the value of this company. If you had to roll forward over the next 2 or 3 years, how does that disconnect resolve? Quickly? Slowly? How does it typically play out?
I have no idea. And I'm not necessarily making a call on MicroStrategy stock itself. I mean, if Bitcoin goes to $1 million, and there are plenty of people out there who preach that it's going to $1 million. I mean, MicroStrategy stock will go up. It just shouldn't be worth more than the value of the stuff that it owns, on a net asset value basis. Who knows? Is the government going to go out and buy and build a Bitcoin reserve? I mean, whether you think that's a good or a bad idea, that would seem to be a pressure, pushing the price of Bitcoin up. It's hard to get inside the head of the one person who's ultimately going to decide that. But if you want to play in these markets, those are the types of judgments that you've got to make. And one of the things you have to consider, too, is there are probably hundreds, if not thousands, of people who would know the answer to that question before you would. So these are not going to be ordinary times for a while.
Yeah.
And if the air starts coming out, it can come out fast. And that's just something that people need to accept as a risk if they want to play in these types of markets.
Well, Jon, this has been terrific.
Yeah, this has been great.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you for joining us.
What'd you have for breakfast? Not eggs. Too expensive. I don't make egg money. I don't know about you guys.
Did you see the egg surcharge at Waffle House? There's an egg surcharge.
Do.
Yeah,
They
there's
do.
an egg surcharge. Yeah.